we found this metal spike underneath the pillow.
It's a Fibonacci spike.
I love MIT so much. Like, specifically, this feels like someone was, like, learning how to use, like, a water jet, and then just kind of abandoned this, like, rough-edged metal.
Also, the fact that you defended this as in, like, it's a Fibonacci spike.
It is.
Like, duh.
It's
this
like
is great. Of course it's
golden
under...
ratio.
No, of course. However... Is that an adequate defense for it being underneath a pillow?
Yeah.
It's Fibonacci. No worries, man.
It's golden. Well, it's not even golden. It's silver. It's both silver and golden.
Yeah.
No, the problem with not the problem. What's the opposite of it's like the answer of this room is that there's wonder waiting around every corner. And really, isn't that what we need in schools? Wonder waiting, even if it's dangerous.
There's something to be said for wonder being a little dangerous. You know, there has to be stakes, right? Like, when do we feel awe? We feel awe at, like, the edge of the Grand Canyon.
Stakes.
Stakes.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel awe at the Fibonacci spike.
I do, too. And it could have just been impaling one of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the other thing that I'm thinking about, and this is slightly segueing into hopefully what we will talk about for a little bit longer, is like, I think that as you're learning and exploring, it's important for there to be stakes, but I think that that's a really hard thing for people who are trying to aid in the learning to like how much stakes should there be? How much like protection should there be? How much safety? Like where that balance lies. You know?
Where are stakes motivating instead of like fight or flight or freeze?
Or like demoralizing also.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's, I guess, a question really about teaching. And on that note, good after morning and welcome to On the Dome, a podcast about how non-expert college-age youth think. And since, we're talking about how college-age people think, one of the biggest influences in how they think is who they're taught by, who teaches them, which is not always the traditional professor, with the gold rimmed glasses and the white hair. I don't have white hair. I'm sorry. Bad visual demo. One day, but I decided to invite two of my favorite college adjacent, youth adjacent people to come talk about teaching. So would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
Absolutely. I am Aubrey Simonson. I am a PhD student at Northeastern University in the College of Arts, Media, and Design, and I keep TAing classes at MIT. Yeah.
You do, and I'm so glad about that. My name is Wyatt Roy. I've been an XR creator for the past 7 years and a filmmaker for the past decade plus.
And also TAing classes.
And also TAing classes at MIT because it's just a really fun place to teach and there's so many good students here.
Yeah.
Every semester has been my last semester for so many semesters.
So we met while you guys were pretty officially TAing and I was sort of vibing next to the TAing a class called, what was it called?
Designing Virtual Worlds.
Designing Virtual Worlds, which we all know is just the VR class. But that was not your guys' first TAing experience? Was it your first TAing experience?
No, I TA'd a bunch while in undergrad, and I took this class.
Right.
Without being an MIT student, or any student, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Which was so fun. So the opportunity to give back and help support it sounded fantastic. How did you get looped in?
That's an amazing question. When I was wrapping up my master's, my PI, as I was getting close to graduating, went, "Wait a second, you don't have a job lined up?" And I was like, "No, I don't." And she was like, "You should meet Ken." So she introduced me to Ken, and Ken was like, "I could use a TA for this class." And I was like, "I could use a job that pays me money immediately." And that's how that started. And that was 2022, and so I've TA'd for him like 5 or some odd times.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So what were your guys' first teaching experiences? And this can be like TAing or like in the 3rd grade I gave a presentation on how the Pythagorean theorem worked or something. Like do you guys have memories of like what those moments were, what those big first things were?
I had one professor in physics teacher in high school, who defined lasers one class as the up-down rhythm in the 1 second. And I thought, oh no, this is terrible. That's definitely not what a laser is, and it's not how a laser works. I think she's trying to get across wavelength or frequency or something, but even that's not quite it. So I ended up just teaching the class about lasers that session. I thought, this is really fun. I don't know if that was the first time, but that really stuck out. What was yours?
This must have been, so when I was an undergrad, I was part of a program called the NAP internship at Wellesley. And all NAP interns were required to teach one open workshop per semester that could be attended by any students or other members of the community. We were given no specifications on what the workshop had to be on, and we were given no specifications on how to teach it. Just teach a workshop. And that was great. That was really lovely. I think the first one that I taught must have been a basic introduction to graphic design with InDesign, which was fine. It went okay. I sort of knew the tool I was teaching. And I don't know, it got me a little hooked.
It's so fun.
It's
Why is it? What made you hooked?
I think some of it is, there is a certain sort of joy in the social dynamic of oh man, this is a thing I actually know how to do, and people can ask me questions about it and I have answers to them sometimes. I think that is actually the thing that really initially got me with it. But I think that now I have hit much more of a space of it's really beautiful to watch other people figure a thing out, and to be able to guide a person through figuring a thing out. Yeah. You?
Yeah. Building the stuff that's in my head is a challenge, always. But at the very least, if I've done it right, then I know what the end result is going to be. It's just going to be a lot of stuff that I have to learn and a lot of effort I have to put in. And at the end, I get, in the physical world or in the real world, a thing that was in my head. But when you're teaching, you're empowering someone else to build what's in their head. And there's this moment where they've made the thing that they were imagining, and that's the first time that I can actually see what was in their head. And so empowering a student to build their own ideas, it feels like the ultimate act of communication.
Yeah,
I like that.
giving people the tools to express things that were previously unexpressible is certainly very powerful. I think that one of the things that I find most interesting about teaching is that there's these really juxtaposed concepts that are really hard to figure out how to I think that, so the four that I was thinking about was passion versus logistics, and then self awareness and self-identity versus empathy. And so what I'm thinking about is we've all had the teacher who just seems to not care about the subject, right? And we've all had the teacher who nothing about them, or it's just they're the mouthpiece for the curriculum, right? And then on the other hand, you have a teacher who's super passionate and fiery, but they never give their quizzes back, or the class is completely disorganized and no one knows where they're going. Or you have the teacher who's very much about themselves and telling them why they're passionate, but doesn't understand why the students might be passionate or might be passionate differently. There's these really weird dichotomies that are also very hard to figure out what to do with. And I guess where I want to that's not a question. The question I guess is are there moments when you've been trying to I want to get into figuring out how to teach, because I feel that's a really interesting process that we can talk about for a long time.
Totally. Do you want to lead with this one, or do you want me to? I think the thing that I've found to be most effective on this is that I don't think it's very common that I meet one person who has all four of those skills really, really well captured in the same person. And so most of the instances of teaching that I've done have involved working with a team, and that team has been very, very helpful. I, in particular, am absolutely garbage at the logistics component. If you send me an email, it's gone. I won't see it.
Sweet pea.
I have an email address. It connects to nothing.
It's so funny.
But, like, I think I get the other parts of it, like, mostly relatively fine. Like, if I show up in the same space as my students, like, until I exit that space, it's generally functioning, which is not 100% of how teaching a class works, but it's some of the parts.
Yeah.
And so when I can, like, find someone to work with who is really good at the logistics part, that tends to work a lot better.
I've already forgotten the question.
Do you have any moments that you can think of, like, maybe let's talk about this semester's class,
Yeah.
because this class, for context for the viewers, it's not a very typical class. So it is a 6-unit class, which is about half of a normal class at MIT, that is 4 credit, and it is offered to Harvard, MIT, Berklee School of Music students, and also we've had some various people wander in, everyone from Wellesley and Mass Arts to high schoolers, rogue high schoolers wandering in, and you, who were none of those things when you took it, but it's all about getting people who are interested, and I think this is Ken's line, I'm stealing it, it's not about teaching people anything, it's about getting cool people in the room together and having them get to know each other. You do a project, there's cave time, it's a different lecturer every week, the professor is not the professor, it is wild and very fun. And so there's a lot of, like, interesting logistical choices that class makes. Maybe if either of you could speak on, like, what do you think that those choices add to the class?
Absolutely. So I'm TAing a different class for a different professor now, and the 2 professors define this spectrum beautifully. So on the Ken side of the spectrum, you have a class that was bounded chaos. Ken drew a boundary, a container within which it was total chaos. Like, we planned the next class the week before it. We planned the homework assignments the week of. The speakers who were going to come in, we were sometimes figuring out right before they came in. And the syllabus was a list of core values. And on the other end of the spectrum, I'm working with this amazing professor, Chris, who has been refining the syllabus year after year after year in order to teach students another creative pursuit. This one's documentary filmmaking, more and more effectively. And different students flourish and struggle in these different environments. And both of these teaching styles have different benefits and costs. It's lovely for me to TA Chris's class because everything is predefined. There's wiggle room, but everything is basically predefined, whereas Ken's felt significantly more stressful because we had to build the plane while flying it. At the same time, with Ken's class, what you get for that spontaneity was the ability to bring in stunning leaders of industry whose schedules are harder to line up, like months and months in advance, and end up giving the students this sense that they are worthy of being in the same space and in the same conversation with a leader of industry. And so you end up, maybe learning fewer skills and than you might in another class style, but you end up with this kind of spiritual growth that's really different. And as a TA, getting to work within these 2 different styles, I get to think, like, my goodness, is there a way to, like, what do I want? Like, where do I want to fall between these spectrums? Or do I want to add a third point kind of off this spectrum and triangulate between? But I think that there's so many different ways of teaching. There's so many different things that'll resonate with folks. And I don't think there's one right answer. It's just fun to see what works.
Absolutely. I think that some of the magic that comes out of this class, I mean, I think that, like, now teaching in, like, the era of the internet or whatever, where, like, most of the skills that I have that I use in, like, my day-to-day life, I learned online and not from a class. Like, thinking about the role that I have as a TA actively teaching a class, like, I think teaching those specific hard skills is not something that I think of as, like, the most valuable thing that I'm doing. Like, I think the most valuable thing that I'm doing as a TA is holding a space in which someone feels safe to learn those hard skills and introducing them to where that information is.
Yeah, there's But at the same time, they've got to. I think the core thing, they still need to learn the hard skills.
Yeah.
But if they can learn the meta skill of figuring out how to learn hard skills, as teaching a person to fish, not making a horse drink water.
No, for sure. And I think that the other thing that I've been thinking about as well is like, in terms of holding space for both, but also recognizing why we might be drawn to one over the other. Like, we all TA'd the chaos class. That's what, well, I mean, I kind of TA'd it, but like, you know, we were all in the chaos group. And I think that what I'm thinking about is like, let's say chemistry, right? Like, there's a difference between like, in 3 months, I'm going to take you on this adventure, and then we're going to make these bets, and I don't really know where it's going to go, but like, you have this camaraderie with your students, if we're going to figure it out together, versus in this class, you're going to learn how a genome works, and by the end of this class, you will know how a genome, like, on the one hand, there needs to be space for both, because like, people need to go on adventures and sometimes know how genomes work. Some people do need to know that. But I think that specifically for VR and XR more broadly, I've noticed that there's this, like, in being in this industry, there is at this point a much higher need for like almost improvisation skills and like pivoting skills, and the meta skills are huge. Learning how to learn something, because I've been a Unity developer for like 3 years, 2 of them professionally, and every time I have to relearn how to open a Unity project, not because I forget, but because Unity changes it, you know? And so, like, it's really, we're trying to build we're not trying to build a sandcastle on the beach. We're trying to build a sandcastle in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah, well put.
And so I think that for this, like, do you see ways where this class needs to be this way because of how this industry is right now, and do you think it will be like that forever with XR?
I mean, as XR formalizes, it may get to a point where we can teach more like the way we're teaching in Chris's class, which like this is how a camera works. A camera works the same way it did a year ago and the same way it did 5 years ago.
Maybe not the same way it did 10 years ago.
Not the way it did 10 years ago, but at least there's more stability in that system. Yeah. At the same time, with your chemistry example, part of me wonders, like, is there some potential in a class where you say you're going to learn about the genome, and at the end of the class you know about the genome, to also say, what's our journey going to be to get there? Like, how can we marry the spontaneity with the structure? And to some extent, every class is marrying spontaneity with structure. Ken had a ton of structure. It was just simply less than this other thing, but I'm sure like Chris's class has a lot less structure than a chemistry class, and so like the moment you draw a line between 2 points, you can also extrapolate in any direction, and we're trying to figure out what that balance is.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that like VR right now is not a mature technology. We're like starting to see a maturing technology. We're starting to see a point where like, oh, like forms are starting to look like previous forms. Things haven't stopped changing incredibly rapidly, but like hypothetically at some point they stop changing incredibly rapidly. It's starting to be something that is used outside of like super hardcore gamers and research contexts. I think the Vision Pro is like really making this happen. And so hypothetically at some point a VR headset becomes something like a camera, where the camera will work the same way that it did last year, and you're not updating all of your slides every 6 months because Unity has moved where the button is for half of the buttons. Yeah. But I don't know, I think it's like there are 2 completely different skill sets here, one of which is like, this is the short-term relevant hard skills of like where the buttons in Unity are right now, and then a completely different skill set of figuring out like, this is a technical thing that I need to do, I don't know how to do it, how do I figure it out? And I think within that, there are like also 2 separate skills, one of which is still the technical skill of, well, like, I need to program in a different language than I know how to use. Where do I go and find that? You know, the like specifics of where information is located and how to teach yourself. But I think there's a different side of it that is a like much more almost like squishier and emotional component, that is a like belief that someone has in their ability to teach themselves a skill just sort of casually when they happen to need it. and the sort of like mild self-discipline required in going, oh, it appears I need to know how to do this thing. Well, time to make that happen. I don't know. I think that thing is the thing that I'm like most trying to teach in our classes.
That's really cool.
I was just going to say that the other thing that made me think of is one of the things that I think that we do really well, which not many classes that I've experienced do, is you were saying like there's these like hard short-term skills, but there's also sort of the squishier like questions. And one of the squishy questions is just like, what's the field, like what are the questions of the field right now? Like what are people thinking about, and what are the themes of this whole, not just this class or this project or this like little part of it, but like what are the themes that the industry is going through? And I think that with one of our, I think it was our second lecture, the one where Russ Gant came in, it was the first time that I have had a class that was like, here is the whole field. Here's some history about it. Here are the questions that we were thinking about then. Here are some of the terms that you're going to hear people using, and here's why all of them are either BS or still in progress, right? Here's like what this idea is and why people are thinking about it. Here's what this idea is and why people are thinking about it. And I kind of think chemistry class should do that more, at least in the chemistry classes I've been in. I've not actually taken chemistry at MIT, so I'm not trying to, have them be catching strays the whole conversation, but like the thing of, like, I think that that's a huge meta skill in addition to learning how to ask questions, and like being able to give someone like, this is where you are, this is why the terms aren't scary, this is what questions everyone's asking, is, I think, now I'm going to pivot it into a different direction, which is, I think it's one of the better ways that we combat imposter syndrome. And now I want to talk about imposter syndrome.
I was about to get there. I'm so glad you brought us there. And the psychological safety to fail.
Yeah.
How do we? You did an amazing thing, class 0 in Ken's class, which was to get up there and say something along the lines of, now forgive me for paraphrasing, but what I heard you say was like, I never thought I'd be here. I never thought I'd be a tech person. And yet, here was my path. Through, I think you did accessibility work.
Yeah, I did a lot of accessibility work. That's why I even majored in computer science. And
yet, and so you felt a ton of imposter syndrome firsthand, and yet that is just core to the experience of trying to build a thing. And you kind of licensed people to feel whatever they're going to feel, and you normalized it, and it was so beautiful to have all of our students get to bask in that perspective day one, because God, XR, every single person in XR has published something cooler than the thing you've done, or been in this field twice as long as you have, which is to say 2 years instead of 1 year. And it's so easy to upwardly compare in this field, in everything, but very much in XR. And to have someone say, hey, the whole thing is developing. If you're growing, then you're doing it. And that was really beautiful.
I think this is one of the things that I've really enjoyed about like XR and teaching in XR as a space, is like, with chemistry and fields like it, like they've existed for a while. There are people who have a lot of expertise in this. VR is really interesting to me in that, like, most people who are working in it now, I would make the claim, have been working in it for like less than 10 years. The field is currently actively growing really fast, and that does mean that, like, for any of my students who I am just introducing to this, like, any expert, or the majority of experts they talk to, only have a few more years of expertise than them. And like keeping that in perspective for people is a lot of fun. Like, they do not right now have, like, when they first, I don't know, like start a class on XR, have like a super informed opinion, but in like 3 months or so they like do.
Yeah, and then in 3 months they become the opinion makers of the space, right? I think that now where this is sort of like leading me is like, I think that XR has had a lot to teach me about how imposter syndrome works. And I think that, especially through Ken's class, I think that in general, teaching a subject that is so emerging has taught me a lot, I think, about teaching, and I think it kind of inherently has a lot. Like, instead of like what teaching has taught us about XR, which is a very interesting conversation, I'm almost now thinking like, I think that there are things that XR has to teach the world about teaching. Like, you know, when you get back into that chemistry class example, like, wouldn't it be great if, like, you could go into a chemistry class and, like, day one exit with, like, oh, okay, here are some of the big concepts of what chemistry is thinking about right now. Now I know. Now I'm ready to be a chemist, you know?
Absolutely.
There's also, it was a strange thing for me to sign up as a TA for this class because I also have to Google every time I open a new Unity project. Unity being the game engine where we develop virtual reality applications.
Yeah.
And that made me, after working in XR for 7 years, feel a sense of imposter syndrome. And I had to remind myself that I'm a TA because I can teach people how to Google, not because I have the answers that we will both discover as we both Google. And there was one session of the hands-on lab, which we called the cave, that this became so apparent, which is you, Aubrey, had taught about hardware on the Monday, and then on the Wednesday, for some set of reasons, you couldn't make it to the cave. So I then found myself giving your presentation on VR, XR, hardware hacking, which I've literally never done, and I had seen your presentation 2 days before, and was basically doing PowerPoint karaoke, which where you're given a slideshow that you've never seen.
I remember I was there for that, yeah.
And it was so fun because I just, as long as you can own it, like, hey, I'm not an expert in this, but we can all figure this out together, and that's the there. That's what XR is teaching me about teaching, to your point. It's, we can all figure this out together.
Yeah, for sure. I remember being in that class specifically, and, like, it was funny because we have a lot of amazing people who are really good at XR hardware in our teaching team, and none of them were there that day. It was like you and me, and I think maybe Jared showed up to save us in, like, the last hour. But it was like me, like, ransacking Lucas's, like, corner of the cave, and I'm like, this is a breadboard, here you go, breadboard, and, like, helping people debug Arduino. And I have never once gotten an Arduino working in my life, but I'm like, you know what, we're gonna Google these error codes together, right? I think that in terms of empowerment, in terms of this, I think the word is empowerment, because, like, the thing that you said about, like, everyone in XR is, like, at most 2 years behind the most experienced person, because there's nothing else, right? I think that that's a really interesting dichotomy that is really powerful to make clear to students. And I kind of wonder if we can lie to students that that's true about other subjects, you know? Not even lie, just, like, frame it that way. Like, you're only, you can be someone considering the questions of the field. You can be talking to industry experts, like you said. Like, I kind of wonder if we can do that with even more established fields in, like, a, you know, because I think that XR lends itself to it for sure, but I don't know. I mean, you guys have also huge backgrounds in other, you know, subjects. You're a PhD student, you're a extremely experienced filmmaker, which are, I think, fields that are still new and still developing for sure. But, like, academia, the world of academia, is old. Film is kind of getting, like, and to be an old thing. Do you guys see pathways for you to take these older disciplines that you guys are very experienced in and try and infuse some of that attitude of, you can break into this? Like, has that influenced you guys?
Okay, so I think the program that I just started is doing a really good job of this. It is it's an interdisciplinary PhD in design and media, and it did a really, really good year for all of us in our first semester, giving us a pair of classes that are like, here is an overview of being a PhD student in a design-adjacent space, which gave us a lot of the context and politics of what it means to be doing a design PhD. Like, I think most of us came in not really understanding a lot of the basics of that. Like, design PhDs are a new thing. They haven't really existed for a long period of time. For a long period of time, the master's was the terminal degree for design, and then you sort of, like, apprenticeship style joined a studio where you learned from other people. And so the PhD is very, very new, and because there is this new credential that other people haven't had in the past, lots of people who are in the field and have been doing this for 20 years don't have PhDs, etc. Getting that context in the first semester meant that we like are now conversant and understand what is going on in people's lives when we talk to other people who've been in this field longer than us. And there's a different class that I was like made to take that is like a research methods course that was just like every single week, here is a research method, here is a different research method, here is a different research method, and not enough like in depth to actually use any of them, but enough to like see the field from a sort of bird's eye view, and then when I hear about other people's research, be able to go, oh, yeah, okay, I know what that is. I can talk about that. I can have a conversation about that. I don't know. I think that the way that we approach a lot of other fields is not starting from this like top-down, context-heavy perspective, and instead is like, here are the basics that you need to know in order to be able to do anything at like a very detailed level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's important, but it's not empowering.
Exactly.
When I was a kid, I lived on the edge of a rainforest next to the beach. I grew up in Sydney, and my dad, pretty early on in my life, organized his work around being able to come home early after school, so that we'd go on, like my sister and I and Dad would go on these walks to the beach, and I'd, as we're walking through the rainforest, I'd see like water skimmers on a pond, and say like, how are they skimming on the surface of the water? And so he'd grab our elbows and be like, we're water molecules, and we want to hold on to each other, and this is what surface tension is. And so, this is my first experience with teaching being embodied in place, and with like my curiosity being rewarded with either answers or a process. Because sometimes I'd say like, honeysuckle is this cute little plant with a flower, and you pick out the stamen and you get a single like raindrop of dew or nectar from it. And I remember saying once to Dad, like, how many honeysuckles would we need in order to make a whole cup of honeysuckle juice? And he was like, I don't know, but here's how we could try to figure it out. And that kind of perspective, I think we can bring, this is basically what we're talking about, like, I don't know, but I think we could figure it out, is I think we could bring to a lot more of teaching. And it brings the curiosity, it brings the wonder back in the proverbial chemistry class, to your design, to a design PhD, or to a PhD in anything. It's just like, how do we make that curiosity more accessible, and the process of discovery.
Yeah, and I think that, so now what I'm thinking about is specifically a field that I'm now in that I think really needs this, which is general computer science. And I love computer science. I took my APCS class and I loved it, and I thought it was fun and puzzles and great. Except there were a couple problems, namely that, like, and this is from my perspective, obviously there were 4 girls in my class and like 15 boys, and we were like, for a long time it was like the 4 girls all huddled in one corner and then the 15 boys engaging in what would start to become like industry conversations, like discussion and whatever. And actually I kind of abandoned my other 3 girls, and I was like, I'm gonna just steal one of the boys' seats, get early to class one day, and sit right in the middle, because I want to be part of this, I think that what we do in the XR class, going back to like that second lecture, top-down thing that you were just talking about, is something that a lot of classes don't do, and I think that it is something that really combats that imposter syndrome of, like, to tie it to what you were saying like, your curiosity gets rewarded not only on an immediate answering your question level, but also on a revealing to you how the questions that you are asking are things that you can answer. And I think that the problem with tech right now is honestly terminology. Like, genuinely, I think terminology is such a huge problem because it's so, like, barricading. I wanna get into, like, more of this idea of how do we break through terminology, and I kind of think part of it is just defining it really early. But, like, are there other ways that we can use this, like, curiosity thing and then, like, turn it into really, like, simple, actionable things?
Computer science is terrible about this. Computer science is so bad about this. Also, the point on gender there is so important. Like, low-key, I did not pivot and start to, like, learn how to program or get into tech until after I started to figure out the gender thing. I just straight up did not start that process before exiting being a woman. I did not overcome the misogyny at any particular point in time.
It's hard.
It's nuts. Yeah, I don't know. I think in some ways, like, CS in particular is so jargon heavy, and tech is so jargon heavy. And I think that jargon is helpful, it's useful, it is nice to have a word that neatly summarizes a large and complicated concept so that you can communicate effectively with other humans. This is why we do language, whatever. And I think that the jargon can be really helpful, and that it creates a strong feeling of like an in-group. Like you have this sort of like secret language of this space, and if you know how to speak it, then you're in. And I think the thing is, like, that jargon is a barrier, and if you can give people that jargon relatively quickly and up front, you have like given them a passageway into the space.
Give them the open sesame cheat codes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, you belong now. But we can also, as folks who know those codes, we can just try to use analogy and metaphor and story to make things more accessible as a teaching mechanic. It was a lot of what, honestly, you did in this hardware slideshow that I then gave. You using a potato as a metaphor,
my God, yeah.
And a traffic jam as a metaphor. So we can come up with these metaphors for things that people can access and make sense of, and then we can say, and here's the jargon term for this thing we were just talking about, and now you get it and you're in. And I think some combination of things, because language is power. To have a very specific label for a concept is such a beautiful shortcut. When two people have seen the same movie and they can say, it's like that scene, and you're like, yes, right? All of a sudden we have a facet of the human experience that we can just both point to and go, I know what you're talking about, right? So labels, common understandings are really important across the board for communication. So I don't think we're ever going to get away from jargon, but how do we as teachers want to leverage it to increase inclusion?
Right. And I think that what you were just saying about like jargon is like language is very tied to power and like traditional structures of power, right? I have noticed, not to again call out the men, but like I have noticed that even from a pretty young age, like I started CS in 10th grade, partially because of existing groups of who was doing CS, partially because of stuff that's passed down from fathers to sons, like all of this different stuff, the guys in my class were much, much more likely to use jargon as soon as they learn it in every scenario, which is great in its own way. It really creates a strong community, which I think that is still lacking in other genders in these fields, right? But it also, like, it's just so, it's definitely like, both prevention and cure at the same time, because we have to give other people the access to this power while still deconstructing the weird, like, you know, notion of that power in the first place. Because, like, language at the end of the day is not, like, pure language-based stuff is not the best way to be accessible, you know? It has to, like, anyways, that can get into its own thing. We could do a whole nother podcast on just language and power and that.
Yeah, I mean, like, in the Unity window where you're developing an XR app, there's a hierarchy where you put all your stuff, and I can imagine a situation in which two people who are just learning Unity are laughing about, well, that's a really messy hierarchy, and someone else has no idea what that means. Are these two people using language to build rapport between them? Yes, but are they also using language to exclude?
Kind of.
Yes. And then if we teach the term hierarchy in this context to this new person, it doesn't necessarily automatically include them, but at least they can understand what's going on. But then are they going to use that understanding to then giggle like, oh yeah, super messy hierarchy, and now someone else is excluded? And it's truly, though, one of the things I've appreciated the most about XR is its otherness, is its frequently its queerness, is its diversity of perspectives of folks who are drawn to making weird, game-changing, hacky stuff because of its difficulty. a lot of the time. And yes, it does. It is like our class was not particularly male dominated, which was really beautiful. And often when I'm in XR spaces, I kind of find that they are more diverse in gender orientation, kind of class, background, race, ethnicity, than most other CSC kind of engineering. And I don't know why, but it's beautiful.
That's honestly one of the main reasons I'm in it, you know?
Wild.
But, like, I think that one of the points that I see as, like, why that is I think that XR is still too both big and too, like, hard in some ways, that whenever, like, if you wanted to build, like, a website, and you wanted to, like, make it a fully functional, pretty website, you could do that all in, like, one language, just pure CS, and be done. And just know that jargon of that group. But I think with XR, we're still at the point where, like, you have to learn jargon from a ton of different things to make any one thing. And so you're constantly at that boundary position of, there's no XR expert. And I think that kind of helps break down that in-group, out-group thing. And I think the other thing is, we as teachers can definitely do that. And I think that might be one of the rules of, like, how do you handle that when you see, like, that exact situation of, like, in-group, out-group, language being a barrier between students?
Yeah. I mean, okay, so a little bit in defense of jargon. Like, I think that jargon has such an effective way of projecting an in-group, out-group boundary. And I do think that, like, one of the things that I try to do as a TA is, like, define, like, okay, like, here is this, like, cool, like, in-group of, like, people who know how to do a thing, and then to, like, open windows into the space to, like, bring my students into feeling like they are part of that in-group. And in many ways, like, all of this is completely a fiction, like, whatever, but jargon does a wonderful job of making
fiction.
Absolutely. Maintaining lots of, like, fictions around the space, I think, is also one of the primary jobs of, like, a teacher in a space. But I think that sort of encouraging the idea that, like, yes, there is an in-group within this particular boundary, and the entrance to the boundary is knowing the jargon, and then teaching a person the jargon is, like, a very fast way to empowering a person, to making them feel like they know what is going on. Being able to say, like, okay, here are 8 words that will come up when you Google, like, how to do anything in Unity. Like, here's what these 5 windows of the editor are called. And then the first time they go, I don't know how to do this thing, and they find a tutorial, and someone in the tutorial goes, okay, now put this thing in your hierarchy, and they go, I know that word. I think they get to feel very legit very quickly. I think there's a high payoff to jargon and teaching it early.
I think maybe it's something around authority, because, like, I think that you're absolutely right, and this is, again, going back to empowerment. Like, we really want people to feel like they can do things and they are part of the people pushing the industry, because they are factually. Luckily, we are not lying to our students. They are, in fact, the people pushing the industry. But I guess the important thing then becomes, how do we give them authority without making them feel like the reason that they have authority is a reason that someone who doesn't know doesn't have authority? You know what I mean? Like, preserving that memory of, look how fast you learn this, and instead of it being like, oh, this other person doesn't know this, is, oh, this other person can also learn this very fast because I did, you know? Like, I think that memory is still pretty strong in XR, which might be why, you know, it's so diverse. It's like everyone's learning so quickly, and everyone has to rely on each other so much right now. How can we preserve that?
And how can we teach it? I mean, and how can we, like, amplify the stories of the folks who just get it? Like, there was one amazing student in our class who took a code base that was a little broken, and she fixed it for the class. And so, like, she went from trying to use something that didn't work to actively being in an authority position, because we were like, okay, great, did you make it work? Yeah, I made it work on my computer. Can you push that code change into the repository so that, like, everyone can now benefit from your work? And she was like, okay. And it's like, how can we be generous with that authority, right? Like, yeah. When we share power, we kind of amplify it, but a lot of folks are scared that they'll lose power when they share power. And when we're all trying to build things simultaneously, I think this is a cultural thing about MIT. It feels so culturally open. It feels so that I've experienced again and again and again, people sharing their resources, sharing their insights, sharing their power, and that just increasing the total potential output of any organization here within the school. That's a perspective that I think you can bring into a classroom, you can bring into a team project that you can kind of bring anywhere.
Totally. I think something that I try to do, and I don't always get the logistics on it right, because I think it can sometimes be a little bit difficult, but in any instance where I have a class or a room full of people who I know have different skill sets, and I know that some people have already learned the thing and some people haven't, it is much better if students who have not learned the thing learn it from a different student who knows how to do it than if they learn it from me. And so trying to set up those structures I think is really helpful, because it does do this thing where someone who has just learned this skill, one, has to like retain the memory of the fact that it is relatively easy to learn because they are teaching it to another person, and it also solidifies their knowledge of it. It's building these little tree structures.
And it's weird because on the one hand, it's kind of like, you know, I don't, if you ever took like a study skills like little lecture that they made you do in high school, they're like, yeah, you know, if you want to remember something well for your test, you should teach it to some. But like actually, like the idea of how can we get someone from zero to understanding the skill, to knowing the skill, to teaching the skill as quickly as possible, and like how empowering that process is. I mean, I think we're proof of that, how empowering that process is, because we went pretty fast from learning about the class to barely understanding the class, which the class didn't even have an identity to understand, to teaching the class, to building that identity, right? Like, how can we let our students do that? I don't know. I think that, I mean, we've definitely covered a lot of very interesting things today. I mean, the theme that I've kind of seen throughout our conversation is like, it's very interesting. Aubrey, you said at the beginning of this conversation that you're very good at everything but the logistics, and I, through this conversation, disagree with you, and I'll tell you why. Like, logistics can be answering your email. You may be bad at that. we can accept that fact, but I think it's really interesting, and also relating it to what you just said, MIT does have this open culture. MIT has all these wonderful things about it that feel magical and open and exciting. And all of them, at the end of the day, boil down to choices that people make, right? You know, on the one hand, it's, you know, passion and empathy and these ideals and these sort of big floaty concepts. But at the end of the day, it's choices of, you know, telling your student to go teach it to someone else, Googling things with them so they know that you're not just this magical authority figure, you know, sharing our story. Like, all of these are ideological decisions, but more than that, they're teaching decisions. And I think that this conversation has very much shown that both of you are very, very good at making sure the logistics of the teaching are considered and match our ideologies and are not just practical, but also radical, which is very exciting. And I don't know, I think that as we wrap up this episode, which unfortunately we do have to wrap up, I want to actually leave it with a message for the fourth wall that I'm now breaking. When you have these big scary fields with these big scary ideas, and you have like this big ideological goal. We have this big ideological goal about what we love about XR and what we love about teaching and what we want to preserve. That translates directly into choices. MIT has an open culture because everybody at MIT chooses every day to make a choice, like to make little decisions to preserve that. Our class is so wonderful because Ken, because you guys, because our students make little choices to keep it that way. So, if you have something you want to learn, if you have something you want to teach, think about the little choices and think about how they tie into these bigger dreams. And it's not easy. You're going to make mistakes, but it's all about the choices and the actions that truly make what teaching is and what learning is. So, on that sort of philosophical note, I don't usually do this, but that's okay. On that philosophical note, thank you so much for listening, and this has been On the Dome. I don't know, it's just kind of like, cool. Yeah, that was really fun.
That was super fun. Yeah, it makes me